makes so much sense. So, the myth of Prometheus and his conflicts with Zeus are some of the most well-known and still relevant stories from ancient and classical Greece. We all know that Prometheus, the proto-myth or the first myth or lesson that essentially Zeus learns, and we know it through this kind of Aeschylean understanding of will, power, and being. That well, Prometheus, he deserves it, right? I think, well, we all kind of have this understanding that sometimes people deserve something, even if it's bad, right? It's still they've pushed their luck too many times, right? So I think we can believe this. Like, imagine if you had a limited power, you would realize that power is like forcing your will upon others. Not ultimately every second. You're not going to be like this power hungry person, but eventually, if you could do something and somebody like tested you, you would use your power to force yourself upon them against their will, right? And that's essentially what power is. And Prometheus, he reveals kind of what is truth, right? What is information essentially, and we know it as light, and like the Greco-Roman way to understand truth, right? That at least I understand is through light, or it's through Apollos, this god of light, that we essentially understand now, right? If you take it further and progress through time, it's like this photon, right? That photon is a particle, right? It's the essence of light. It's a related, well, through the naming convention, right? Phoebus, that we know is Phoebus Apollo, right? He is truth, and that we can't even imagine. You couldn't even imagine a scenario where light, in any form, let alone the sun, right, doesn't exist, right? But somehow we know the truth, right? We know what is out there. You could like navigate your way in a car down the street without the sun or light or anything, right? You could probably create a computer simulation theoretically where like this second law of thermodynamics, right, that seems to be violated, right? But you would need to really run like simulations of the simulations, right? That computers themselves are dependent on observation of truth through light. They're stuck in that paradigm, right? You couldn't build a computer without light or like electricity or anything like that, right? It's pretty simple. It's not necessarily profound, but it's that this ultimately is a matter of perspective, right? It's what system boundary or system we choose is important, right? And it's going to lead to different kind of outcomes, right? Or perspectives on morality, right? So I'm not going to get too much into thermodynamics, but I think it's important because I think essentially that's what we're talking about, right? With Prometheus, and especially, right, the Hebrew myths, right? These gods, these fire gods, right? And it's not necessarily what we think of today, but right, where thermodynamics is this it's more like this quantificates, this kind of like calculation, plug and chug. But there's a lot of qualitative and theoretical aspects to it, right? And I think that's, that's like, I mean, some of these books, and you probably couldn't even go to some colleges without your professor. Well, he's either going to have to be fluent probably in Greek, or he's going to have to he might know about some of these Hebrew myths, right? He's going to have a perspective that's from a farther time. It's so, because essentially what you're talking about is fire, heat, and then it's ultimately related to truth, right, through light. And that's, well, you can say that's thermodynamics, but you could also say that's like Christianity. It's the Hebrew myths. It's also part of the Greco-Roman pantheon. So we can relate information to light, right? It's this end result or moral of the story, right? We detect it as light. We can see this. This is how all our experiences, even when we dwell in the imaginary plane, it's kind of through light. We don't really see in like black and white, right? Our dreams are in color. We see in light. It doesn't even matter if it's in color, but we see in light, right? That we understand light as truth, so we believe it. And no matter what, if you use like an electric detector, you're essentially going to be measuring photons, right? And this is like saying that Apollo in his essence is time, but he's also like the light, and he's the truth, right? So Hesiod, he says that the sun goes out to Oceanos, where Oceanus is like the house of youth, right? That essentially translates into this house of youth, or it's like maybe we can understand it as Ponce de Leon, right? It's like a fountain of youth. And the sun goes out there. It doesn't age. Time goes forward, right? The sun doesn't die. The Apollo is a eternally youthful god, but we know that time goes forward, right? That there's this night and day, but it only goes into the future. This time, this line going forward. We understand this as the way to define our universe, right? That time, again, goes forward, and that light is fundamentally truth. Like the observation is what allows us to determine what's true or not, right? And this moral comes at the expense of Prometheus, right? In this pull through his midsection, right? But he ultimately deserves it, right? It's got to be accepted the bounds of a system to make sense, right? That you had this covenant with Zeus, or this convention, right? That there exists this outer bounds. Your existence is your outer bounds, as this outer shell of being. Perspective is really everything, right? It's perspective. So Prometheus is the son of Iapetus. So, but Hesiod says, well, it's kind of like if you say it together, it's like diapetos. So it's probably understand it as like double cross someone, and ultimately to rub someone the wrong way, right? Like do we understand that somebody might rub you the wrong way, or they double cross you, and that they probably deserve it, right? And that's Prometheus. And it's, well, first we know that he first tricks them by disguising the choice parts of meat in the organs of a cow, right? And then he makes fat and bones look like the choice cuts of beef, and then Zeus is deceived, right? So he there's like these bones that look like good meat, and then there's the good meat that's hidden from him in the organs that doesn't look good. So he goes for the stuff that looks good, and then it deceives him. Then he warns Prometheus. He says, "Don't ever do this again." Right? He says, "Don't double cross me. Don't rub me the wrong way." And then before I go ahead and talk about the next trick, I think it's important to examine his patronymic name, right? So he's the double crosser. So I think he deals with like reversibility of systems. Again, he's this kind of understanding of entropy, whether a system is reversible or not, or how reversible it might be, right? That although time goes forward always, you can compress a spring and pull it into tension, and the opposite, right? That you can do these kind of like oscillations that time can kind of reverse and then go back, but it's not necessarily that you're going back in time, right? That it's just that the system itself is kind of reversible, but over time you're going to lose energy, right? You don't see the energy being lost to heat. It comes off as this infrared light, right, that you can't detect, right? It's only technology allows us to see the truth now. But the system isn't without its perfections, right? The gods aren't perfect. The gods just last forever. So the forces are going to be around, that gravity is going to be around when you die, but it's not necessarily like this perfect god that you can't overcome. So that Prometheus is able to kind of trick Zeus, so he's like resetting a trap, or the spring is going to be tricked again, right? There's a little bit of reversibility, but most likely it includes these eternal stresses that we understand as increases in entropy, or it's like this dissipation of the energy is this friction, right, that's creating heat, that you're rubbing something the wrong way, right? It's like this friction. How do you create fire with, right? Zeus, we know, controls the fire. He was like this spark grinding god, but that this is from friction, right? It's from friction. So that's diapetus is the crossover, so rub somebody. So it's like entropy. Well, it's like if you have this smooth surface, that's going to be a lower entropy surface, right? It doesn't have all these random nooks and edges and crannies that are going to jut out just kind of randomly and cut you. And then what's that going to do? It's going to alert you that you're in pain, that you're going against the grain, right? So it's like the system is reversible, but it's only in the ability to dissipate the heat without warming the mass, right, that you're recording the temperature of, right? So, right, like, so if you can get rid of the heat, then you'd say, oh, it's completely reversible. But that's not how it works. Friction doesn't work that way. That when you apply the work or the friction, that you heat something up, right? And then we know this is fire, that you can cook food with fire, right? You can bake bread with fire. That Prometheus allows you to bake bread. That fire itself is synonymous with wheat, or like a type of barley or wheat. That bread itself, right, is synonymous with baking and fire. But ultimately, fire is information, right? It's light. That's what we learn from the second trick. But that's what probably the most important moral of is that that it's light, right, is information. And it's interesting in that some tellings of Prometheus, he steals the fire from the sun, right? It's the light and heat of the earth is the sun. So Zeus gives Prometheus a second chance, but he sets this boundary that Prometheus doesn't cross him again, right? So it's a matter of perspective. And Zeus sees it that itself, light is information, right? That's what alerts him that Prometheus has done something wrong again, right? And then he puts Prometheus far off place, and he puts the pole in his midsection, and that he says, like, that everyone can see Prometheus from this high up place or this far away place, right? That he, in a sense, he's like a lighthouse, or he's like a beacon, or he's just like information that fire is not just to heat food, but it's also this method of relaying something, right? That light is kind of this information that you can detect it through your eyes, through seeing it. And that, again, entropy ultimately is going to increase in a system. So it's like, well, why do you even build a lighthouse or a beacon in the first place? Well, so Hesiod says that, again, that you want to see Prometheus from a far off place. So it's like if you crash your boat in the water, you can't rebuild it, right? You're just going to be worrying about saving yourself. You're not going to rebuild your boat. And I think you'll say, okay, well, that's like an increase in entropy. Why don't you just leave it in darkness, right? Or why wouldn't it just stay in darkness? Like, why do humans make light to see things if it's going to decrease the entropy? Well, you say, no, it doesn't. It increases the amount of states that I think there's a argument over whether entropy is disorder or it's macro versus micro states. It's ultimately the matter of states, or like checkered blocks on a checkerboard that you can have, right? So if you can light up the port or the water with a lighthouse, people aren't going to crash, but you're also going to allow civilization, like you're going to have a port and you're going to allow civilization to grow, right, itself. That you're going to have the port, trade, but you're also going to get rid of all the thieves and tricksters of the night, right? These Prometheus, that you're going to be able to catch them. And that's kind of his punishment. That's the lesson that ultimately, if you want your civilization to grow, right, you got to have this will and power to get it done, right? And that's to force people against their will. That's what power is. And that's going to allow for the most states, or the states of being, this Zeus, to be most powerful, right? That the entropy of the system is always going to increase. And we know this because we can detect it through the light. That is essentially how we know we exist,